Welcome back to this series of Exploring Objectivism. I'm Gloria Álvarez, and today I'm interviewing Rob Tarr. Rob collaborated in a book called Foundations for a Free Society, a compilation of essays where they discuss the differences between objectivism and libertarian ideas. Rob, thank you so much for this interview. I wanted to pick your brain about your background because I read and I saw some interviews of you. You started with the liberty ideas, reading Milton Friedman and Ludwig von Mises. So how did you come up knowing these ideas?
Sure. Actually, I started as a young teenager, actually, that got exposed to these ideas. I had an uncle who gave me Human Action to read from Ludwig von Mises when I was 12 years old.
12 years old.
A little bit ambitious. I don't think I understood very much of it
right
at that time. He also gave me Milton Friedman's book, Free to Choose, which I did understand fairly well, and I was able to grasp his arguments for free markets and against government intervention. So that was one sort of input. At the same time, I was also getting interested in investments, and I was reading some investing books, which I didn't realize were written by libertarians, and they were talking about economic theories that were von Mises' business cycle theory. And I had no idea at the time that that's what it was, but I was getting very interested in this field. And similarly, around the same time, I encountered Ayn Rand's novels, so that was sort of kindled also an interest in capitalism and free markets. At the time, I didn't realize that all three of those were related. I didn't realize that Ayn Rand had some commonalities with Austrian economics, and I didn't know that Austrian economics was what these investors were talking about. But that sort of became my three passions for the rest of my life, that pursuing philosophy, economics, and investing.
Do you have any idea how your uncle was familiar with the Austrian economics?
I'm not really sure, actually. No. He studied economics in college, but never pursued it as a career. But it was just his lifelong hobby and interest to be learning about Austrian economics and about free market ideas. So,
did she know Ayn Rand or like her work?
He knew Ayn Rand of her books, but was never that interested in it, I guess you could say.
Right.
But he would engage me in long conversations about Austrian economics and Milton Friedman and free markets, what was going on in the news, and how to interpret it from a free market perspective and that kind of thing. So, so it was very formative for my intellectual upbringing.
So about Austrian economics, for people who think that economics is all about like math and numbers and predictions, one of the basic difference that I see is that Austrian economics emphasizes that economics is a human process. It's about decision making. And some people say, but wait a minute, that's too simple. Economics has to be more logical, more mathematical, right?
Right. Yes, and that's the big difference between mainstream economics, or in some ways it's called neoclassical economics, and Austrian economics is just what does it center on. In the essay that you mentioned that I did for the Foundations of a Free Society, that's one of the things I traced down to the philosophic roots of what is their conception of value, what is their conception of the good. And so for von Mises, it's human action, which is goal-directed human action. So we as humans, we come up with goals, and then we try to figure out plans to achieve our goals. So his whole economics is about describing how does that process work out in the economic realm.
Yeah.
But that drops out of mainstream economics. They are more centered on an equilibrium framework, and that's where the math comes in. So it's just about how do we mathematically solve for what all the prices are, what all the quantities are, and then that's the equilibrium level of whatever for the economy or for any particular product. Now, what I think the big difference is that for von Mises, this process of humans achieving goals, conceiving goals and seeking goals, is that it involves knowledge. So when you conceive a goal, that's something you think about. You think about like what would be good for me to pursue, what would be a good goal, what would add to my life. And then once you have a goal, that becomes a problem to solve. That's something that you want to achieve. Well, how do you do that? So then it's a thinking process of, well, how do I pull together a plan that will help me to achieve that goal? So it's all involving the thinking process of how to do that. And so his whole economics is centered on that thinking process. For the mainstream economics, that drops out completely. So it's just, for them, one of their main assumptions is all knowledge is given. So we know all the products that are possible, We know all the scientific and technological things we could do. We know the value of all the products, how they're useful to us. So the only thing left to do is just to run a mathematical algorithm to say, okay, well, what are the prices and quantities? So there's no rational, creative thought process in there. It's just mathematical algorithm. You just deduce the answers. So for Rob Mises, you've left out the essence of what human action is about. That's the essence of our lives as humans is we're conceiving goals and we're pursuing goals. So mainstream economics takes no account of that.
Now, that's also the difference between the central planners who claim that because they have all the knowledge, they can plan the economy, they can control prices, they can give subsidies to the companies that they think need subsidies, or protectionism, and ban others or regulate others that should, not participate in the market. And that destroys the equilibrium of free competition and free enterprise. Yes. Ludwig von Mises referred to prices as traffic lights that can go red, yellow, or green, right, depending on the agreements in between two individuals that are trading. And they establish a price that they both agree, okay, for me, giving you this money is less valuable than receiving the good, and for you, it's more valuable receiving the money that I'm giving you, right? And that's a process that you couldn't control because there's millions of humans taking those decisions. That's the human action.
That's right. Yeah.
And that makes more sense. I mean, that's something that someone without a university degree can understand. But still, the mainstream economics that dominate the world is the central planners.
Yes.
Human action is not it's the economy that actually works, is the one that you see implemented in the black markets, is the one that poor people use whenever they are doing transactions. Mm-hmm. But at the level of state policy, it's the central planners that always win the debate. And one of the one of the economists that they use is Lord Maynard Keynes.
Yes.
And Keynesianism is this claim that we can plan the economy from top to bottom, right? Do you think that because this kind of economy can be used by governments to manipulate the economy, that's the reason why it is the mainstream economy?
It's definitely possible. There was a certain thread of thought where government controlling the economy is the right way to go. That is what was considered moral, ethical, practical, and so on. And the economics of mainstream economics definitely supports that or allows that, or it's logically possible given mainstream economics. But for von Mises, that was actually one of his early discoveries, was that socialism is impossible. It's impossible for central planners to know how to manage the economy. Mm-hmm. And he wrote a famous paper in 1920, which launched this debate with socialists, the socialist calculation debate. And his main argument was economic calculation is impossible under socialism, and therefore socialism has to fail. And the gist of his argument was that there's so much information in the economy, and it's impossible for central planners to know everything, and it's impossible for them to value. So the example he gives in his paper is that, let's say that you have a train track and there's a mountain, and you need to get around that mountain. So the train could go around the mountain, it could go through the mountain, or it could go over the mountain. Mm-hmm. So each of those is technologically possible. So scientifically that's possible. But which one is better? How do you know which is more cost effective, which is more valuable? And he said there's no way for central planners to know that. So they can know the technology, they can know it's technologically possible, but to know which one is better, the only way to know that is with the price system. So the price system embodies all the values and all the uses of everything in the economy that tells you what's more valuable or what's less valuable. So you can calculate with the prices and say, okay, this project costs this much, this one costs this much, and so on. And then you can choose which one is better. Without the price system, there's just no way for central planners to make that kind of decision.
And that's the reason why Leonard Reed wrote I Pencil, right? To put in a very simple example that the knowledge into making a pencil is worldwide dispersed, and no one knows exactly all the things that need to be done for a pencil to exist, let alone a smartphone, a computer, a helicopter, or even the buildings that are being built right now in New York City. The knowledge is dispersed, and that's something that Hayek said about the impossibility of a human mind to know everything, and that's the arrogance of central planners. But for the mainstream, central planners are seen as the good guys, the moral guys, the ones that want everyone to, have wealth, and that's better than just leaving the free market and its evil disorder to take place, right?
Yes, yeah. And I mean, I think ultimately that goes back to morality, and that goes back to a conception of value. So for von Mises and for Ayn Rand, this is her concept of objective value, which is unique to her in philosophy. So to her, value is a goal. So you conceive a goal, and then you creatively think how to achieve it, and that's where the value is. That's the only source of value, is that you figuring out what's good for you and then thinking about how to achieve it. The central planning perspective is, well, no, we can have these aggregate goals. We can have these goals for society as a whole, and then we central planners are going to act collectively to impose these values on society as a whole. And so that's kind of the main motivation, I guess, behind central planning. But that's a particular view of what values are. So for von Mises and Ayn Rand, they would say, well, there's no real sense that that's a value. That's basically forcing some people to sacrifice their values for the sake of other people,
right,
to achieve this aggregate result.
Now, on Foundations of a Free Society, there's a lot of essays in between the libertarian theory and the objectivist theory, and you have a foot in both worlds, right? You know a lot about both worlds. One of the criticisms that I've heard about objectivists to the libertarian movement is that they lack philosophy. But sometimes when I've read Mises or Hayek, or even inspirations of them, of Frédéric Bastiat, for instance, I do find some sense of philosophical explanations towards why human action and economy let free has some moral backgrounds. Do you think it's fair, the critique that some objectivists make, that the problem with libertarians is that they only stick to economics and politics, but they don't go deeper into philosophical explanations?
I guess it depends how you look at that. So in one sense, if it's about defending capitalism, so I think Ayn Rand would definitely say almost all defenders of capitalism don't go down to the philosophical level. So they try to defend capitalism in economic terms, and she thinks that's a losing game. Like, you'll just never win if you do that, because you will be, in effect, accepting the premises of your opponents, and then because you've accepted those implicitly, eventually they're going to win. So an example of that would be anybody who defends the free markets on the grounds that it produces some aggregate outcome for society. So, a common one is that the free market provides the best allocation of resources. So that's an aggregate perspective. And Ayn Rand thinks, well, if you take that perspective, then you're taking a collectivist perspective, and you're saying, some particular aggregate outcome is what we're aiming at. But that feeds into what the central planners want to do, is they say, yeah, we're trying to achieve this aggregate outcome, and that's what justifies it, not the individual pursuing his own goals. So Ayn Rand would say, the only justification for capitalism is taking it down to man's nature as a rational being, as a creative being, as a goal-seeking being. And that's that's how you have to defend capitalism, is that you have the right to do that, and you should have the right to do that, not because it causes some aggregate outcome. So in another sense, von Mises did have a philosophy. He did try to ground his economics in certain philosophic principles. So from that point of view, Ayn Rand thought he was just wrong, that his philosophy was wrong.
Did he have a name for that philosophy?
Well, not per se, but and it's not a full-blown philosophy. It's more just that he tried to give a philosophic basis for his economics. So, what the philosophic points he thought he needed to ground his system of economics, that's what he developed. But he didn't develop it into a full-blown.
Did other libertarian scholars try to go further on those initial philosophical
I think there are, yeah. So, I mean, one of his philosophical principles was he coined what he thought was a new field, which he called praxeology. So praxeology for von Mises was the science of goal-directed human action. And so I understand why he felt the need to do that, because that is what he needs as the basis for his system of economics. And ethics, philosophic systems of ethics, none of them encompass that under ethics. So he felt like he was describing a new field. He felt like he was pioneering a completely unknown field, which he called praxeology. Now for Ayn Rand, her view is that the science of goal-directed human action is ethics. That's the center of what ethics should be about. And that's part of what makes her ethics so distinct from other ethical theories.
Now, if Ayn Rand came up with a new philosophy that didn't exist in the rest of human history, wouldn't it be a little bit unfair from her or the objectivist movement to say, okay, but you know, libertarians didn't go all the way through since von Mises came before? I mean, if we look at human history and the evolution of philosophy, either you stand in the shoulder of giants or you do something new, but you're constantly building upon something that came from before, right?
Right.
So what would Ayn Rand's critique be of the praxeology of Mises that came before her?
Yes. Well, I guess, you know, it's hard to put yourself into the frame of mind of somebody who's an intellectual genius, which I think Ayn Rand was, and I think Ludwig von Mises was.
Yeah. On what are the things that Rand would criticize about like Mises not being, let's say, complete enough?
Right. Well, the praxeology would be one. So she would encompass whatever he was trying to do with praxeology. She would say that falls under ethics, under her ethics, her theory of ethics. And then there were a few other points that she picked at, like, you know, the Austrians are known to have a subjective view of value. And I actually argue in my essay, I don't think it fully is. They call it subjective, but implicitly, I think, is very much in the vein of Ayn Rand's objective conception of value.
Okay. Like, for example, the paradox between diamonds and water.
Right.
Like, how come diamonds are so expensive when they are not vital to human life, whereas water is, but it all amounts in scarcity, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So so Adam Smith had that water diamond paradox, and he said he comes from an intrinsic value perspective. So for him, the value is in the object, apart from, you know, human beings valuing it for some purpose or some context. So he had the diamond water paradox. So, like, you know, it seems like water should be more valuable than diamonds, but it's not. So, okay, so then where do we look for the value of it? So it's not, you know, so the thing that's more useful is not more valuable. Water is more useful because we die without it. So he said, well, where does the value come from? Oh, it must come from the inputs, from the costs. So the labor theory of value, for example, that is the amount of labor that went in to produce it. And then the marginal revolution, which happened around the 1870s, was a complete flip to a new theory of value, which was called subjective theory of value, which is you only value things, you value specific units within a specific context for a specific purpose, and that comes from you, the valuer. So, you know, if you're in the desert, then, you know, one glass of water, so a specific unit of water might be the most valuable thing in the world to you. You know, if you're sitting in a room like this where there's gallons of water, you know, this cup of water, even if I spill it, doesn't cost me anything because we can go get another glass of water. So it's, you know, not a high value because you know, there's other water that we can get. So that was conceived as subjective value. So you know, it comes from each person, each subject valuing it. But from the objectivist point of view, I would argue that kind of math that puts two things together. That puts a truly subjective theory, which is things have value just because you like them, just because they give you pleasure. And that's the theory of value that goes into the mainstream neoclassical economics. But there's also a theory of value where it's subject dependent. It depends on the subject, but it's a subject who's conceiving goals and making plans and has purposes. So both the mainstream neoclassical theories, they consider themselves subjective value theories of economics. The Austrians call themselves subjective value theories of economics. But what I argue is that no, they're actually implicitly objective value in Ayn Rand's sense. And that's what the big difference is between Austrian economics and mainstream. Now, part of the problem is because Austrians have called themselves subjective value, or they think that's what they're doing, they've conceptualized it that way, they start to move away from, you know, an implicitly objective value view towards a more actually subjective value view. So one of the things von Mises does with that is this idea of consumer sovereignty. So it's just the consumer's subjective values, that's what drives the economy. That's what gives value to everything. There's a sense in which that's true because the consumers are the ones who are ultimately buying everything.
Yes.
But in a deeper sense, it's the producers who are doing the valuing. So they're the ones who, the consumers can only value what the producers come up with. So, there's no consumer walking around in 2001 saying, wow, I really value iPhones. I wish somebody would produce that.
Exactly.
So it's Steve Jobs who's thinking, what could I make? What would be useful to human life? What would be valuable and so on? And he comes up with the idea of an iPhone. And so he's the one who first valued it. He's the first one who came up with the idea and the goal and the plan of how to produce it economically, how to make a profit from it.
And your argument is that Austrian economics do recognize that some of the value comes from the producers, but they didn't name it that way.
Exactly,
Okay.
yes. Yeah.
And how has that view been taken by your objectivist peers and your libertarian peers?
The idea from my essay?
Yeah.
I'm not sure yet. It's fairly new and fresh out, so haven't gotten a lot of feedback. So I guess we'll have to see. Time will tell.
Cool. But so on Foundations of a Free Society, the purpose of writing this book, because I also feel a little bit like you. I studied in a university where they teach you Austrian economics regardless of the career that you choose. You have to go through courses of economic process 1, 2, and 3. You study Henry Hazlitt, you study Hayek's philosophy, Mises' philosophy. Rand is always around.
Okay.
There's an Atlas Shrugged sculpture there. There's no specific, well, now there is. When I was studying, it was not like a specific course on Ayn Rand.
Okay.
But it's like the founder of this university, he managed to bring everyone who is a freedom defender from the economics perspective and the morals perspective into one place where you can study them all, right? And you have the Mises Library, the Atlas Shrugged sculpture, the Hayek Auditorium, like trying to find the commonality.
Okay.
And what I see sometimes is that in the libertarian movement, some people say, no, but objectivists are too purists. They are too exaggerated. And objectivists say, no, libertarians are, only on the surface. They don't go deep enough. And for me, I can understand where those criticisms come from, but I see so many things in common. And I don't understand, like, instead of saying, okay, like a specialization of work, right?
Right.
Everyone dedicating themselves to what they're good at, okay. Ayn Rand provided the roots of the philosophy, and I discussed this with Greg and with Harry Binswanger. I was like, can we see this like a tree, where like the roots are the philosophical grounds of objectivism, and then you have like the branches of the tree where you go into public policy, and you have public choice, and you have Austrian economics, and you have libertarian marketing. Like, can it all work together in order to like spread the ideas coherently? And their answer was no. But when I read something like Foundations of a Free Society, I think that that's an attempt to find common ground and also criticisms.
Yeah, and I guess it depends how you are looking at it exactly. So again, I would distinguish between economics and political philosophy, or how to defend capitalism.
Yeah.
So, if the libertarian idea is only defend capitalism on economic grounds, again, I think that's a losing strategy. That fails, and it's been going on for decades, if not centuries, and has not made a lot of progress. Now, I do think there is good commonality on the economics of Austrian economics and objectivism as a philosophy, and that's my essay. I hope to bring that out more and to convince more people of that, so that on the objectivist side, people understand there is a tremendous amount of value in Austrian economics, and it has a lot of commonalities with objectivism. So, we should embrace Austrian economics. Do I think it's perfect? Not necessarily, because it didn't have the explicit correct philosophic base, just an implicit correct philosophic basis. So there are errors and around the edges that things could be cleaned up or fixed up. But the core of it, I think, is brilliant and important, and objectivists should embrace that and help to spread that as the right economics. And then on the flip side, I hope that people interested in Austrian economics come to see how important it is to have the philosophic base, and that the main difference between mainstream economics and Austrian economics comes down to these philosophic conceptions of value.
Right.
So, if Austrians really want to defend what they're doing, they need to go down to the philosophic level and show, look, we're assuming this conception of value, mainstream's assuming this conception of value, and then argue on that basis, this one's right, that one's not right.
Now, if we go to how things were when all these people were alive and it was Rand and Mises, and there are a lot of evidence that there were criticisms, but there was also a lot of admiration in between each other.
Yep.
There's a legend, I don't know if it's true, that in one Montpellerin society, von Mises stood up for Rand and said to a bunch of economists and scholars, say what you want about her, but at the end, more people have been familiar with these ideas thanks to her novels than any of the papers that you have written and published.
Okay.
And that seems to me one of the dichotomies. There's a portion of libertarians who say, listen, not everyone in the world is going to go deep into philosophy. So if we have a strategy of only focusing on the economic side of it and the politics side of it, we have a better chance at selling these ideas. But at the same time, the woman who has sold more books and the novels that have inspired millions into these ideas have been Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, right? Yes. So it's like, wait a minute, are people too lazy to go into philosophy? And if so, why is it that Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead are way more known and read than Human Action or The Constitution of Liberty by Hayek?
Right. I mean, it's a good question that why more people don't go into philosophy or aren't drawn to philosophy. I think part of it is a lot of people who read Atlas Shrugged read it from an economic or political perspective. So they grasp that it's about a certain political system or political ideas. They grasp that it's putting forth certain economic ideas. They don't necessarily grasp that it also has embedded in it, a much deeper philosophic conception. So ethics and epistemology and metaphysics are all there. But I mean, you have to read it more carefully and more deeply to grasp that. So, I mean, it is popular among libertarians, among conservatives and so on. But, I mean, especially conservatives, you see, it's all just the economic message that they grasp onto. Yeah.
Because that's the other thing. I mean, if you read Ayn Rand, she had so many differences with conservatives. Even in her essay, Conservatism and Obituary, she says that for liberty and the cause of liberty, sometimes conservatives do more harm than even the left.
Right.
And on everything that today is an issue that has been taken from the left, like abortion or drugs or sexual liberty, those are issues that the conservatives don't want to talk about. And Rand talked about them in her novels as something that was very normal. And in that time, it was more controversial than right now. So on one side, you have the conservatives who want to ignore some of those issues. They just want the economic side of it. The left, they do talk about these issues, but always the answer is more government. Throw more government at the problem, collectivism, and it's going to be solved. So objectivism actually brings a very fresh alternative to young people who are both concerned about the economic system, that sometimes I confuse it with capitalism, but also the moral issues of a free individual. So since you move in between the two worlds, right? Another of the issues is that libertarians say, okay, yes, maybe objectivism has everything nailed down, but it's so pure that in the real world it's not pragmatical. And to be pragmatical, you have to compromise. And for example, Milton Friedman advised Augusto Pinochet and the Chicago Boys in Chile. And what they implemented in Chile was like a free market dictatorship, right? 3,000 people were killed. I mean, for a dictatorship, those are low numbers. I even questioned my Chilean peers, was it necessary? Like, was it necessary to kill 3,000 Chileans in order to implement free market economics? I never had like a clear answer on that.
Okay.
And then another example that comes to mind is Margaret Thatcher in England, right? Implemented free market economics inspired by Hayek. But if you put both of those governments into the perspective of objectivism, they don't meet the standard.
Right.
They don't
right.
need the whole thing. But who can then in politics?
Right. Well, and I mean, I think from my perspective, I think Ayn Rand, when she says, when she's against compromise, she's against compromise on principles. So never compromise on principles, because then you're effectively giving away the case to your enemies. So if you try to defend capitalism on collectivist grounds, then you're going to lose that debate, because the collectivists they're more consistent. They sound, you as a free market person, you're going to sound hypocritical because you're saying, selfishly go after profits and so on, because that's what's best for the collective. So the collectivists are going to win that debate in the long run, she thinks. But she wasn't against necessarily cooperating with people on a political level, but she thought it had to be on a very specific ad hoc basis, in such a way that you're trying to achieve some concrete results and you're not compromising on principles. So you're not agreeing to principles that are going to undercut your philosophic basis. Yeah. So for example, school vouchers. She thought if there was a political movement to bring about school vouchers, or I think she was actually in favor of tax credits for education.
Tax what?
Tax credits for education. So so whatever you pay for school, you can deduct from your income tax.
Okay.
So if there was a ad hoc movement for that, and it was made up of libertarians, conservatives, objectives, she said, by all means, join that, as long as nobody from the top imposes a certain platform that embodies false philosophic principles. So as long as it stays as a concrete result you're trying to bring about, there's no problem collaborating. You don't want to compromise on the principles, though. You don't want to endorse a group that's espousing principles that undercut your principles, though.
So, for example, in the case of Augusto Pinochet or Margaret Thatcher, on a specific public policy against, for example, dissolving a union and privatizing a state company, she would say, okay, go for it. But don't ally with a dictator that in order to implement free market is gonna go against the principle of life, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. It's a good question. I can't obviously speak for her, but it'd probably be something along those lines.
No, I ask you that because I don't know, like I try to picture someone, an objectivist political candidate,
okay.
And trying to implement an agenda that is absolutely coherent with objectivism without compromising, if that would be feasible in today's world, because the only reference that I can see in the United States is Ron Paul, for example, or Gary Johnson on the last elections. But if I contrast their agenda, for example, Ron Paul with abortion, he was against abortion, against legalizing abortion. So I will always find things that libertarians in presenting politics are going to be disagreeing with objectivists.
Right. And I don't think it's possible to have a pure objectivist candidate, per se.
Yeah.
And she always stressed that the battle is not at the political level. So the battle is at the intellectual level. So what needs to happen is spread the ideas, educate people, and then once the ideas are widespread enough, people will start to demand and vote for candidates who are going to enact those policies. She said a political campaign is not the time to try to educate people. So if people don't have those ideas and you try to run as as a pure free market person, you're just not going to win, because the people are not going to vote for you. The ideas are not well known, or they're not accepted, and so on. So she was very much that the real battle is on the intellectual level. But that doesn't mean you can't support a candidate who's mixed. So, she, in her newsletters over the years, she would make recommendations or her opinion on who the better candidate was in different elections. So she's not against endorsing certain candidates over other candidates.
Yeah. I agree that political campaigns are not the time to educate people. That's when it happens too late. And it always happens to me in Latin America. We have elections every 4, 5, 6 years. And whenever I go to a country and I explain to them, listen, it's about changing the mentality, especially in Latin America, where we have this victimization culture, and poverty as it is seen as a virtue. And so I try to explain to them, this is about a psychological shift, and it was predicted since 200 years ago by Simón Bolívar and our founding fathers. They were like, listen, societies here are not ready to be free because they don't want to be responsible. That's the principle of the individuality, right? Freedom means responsibility, the ability of responding on your own acts. And when I try to explain that to them, they always say, okay, yes, that's what we need to do in the long run. But we have elections coming up right now, and we need to do something now. So what do we do? And I'm like, you're not getting it, right? It's so frustrating. But at the same time, I understand that most people don't think on the long term. They're always thinking on the short term, and maybe both things can coexist. You know, you do the intellectual work on the long run, but at the same time, we have to prevent some lunatics to go into power, right? And you need to have like a quick fix in order for that not to happen. And one example that comes into mind is the financial crisis of 2008. I don't know about you, but for the American friends that I have that are not involved in libertarian movements or objectivist movements, if I grab 10 Americans that I know outside of these movements and I ask them, was the financial crisis a consequence of capitalism? 9 of 10 are going to say yes. So that was a huge opportunity into educating people of the dangers of the central planners trying to control the economy. Why do you think it was lost, that opportunity? Why do you think not the libertarians, not the objectivists, everyone failed into making people understand that this was the government forcing the banks to give credits to people that were not going to be able to pay them. And that, of course, was the perfect excuse for banks to get corrupted. And not only that, when they had to like just go bankruptcy, they were saved with taxpayers' money. You know, it's like a whole cycle. And why do you think that happened?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. You know, for one, I think the left did a very good job of painting it with their version of events. So you're basically interpreting it from the lens of this is evil capitalists who brought down the system. So bankers and mortgage lenders and so on. And you know, I don't think, you know, first of all, free marketers were pretty small to start with. So it would have been pretty hard to have a voice anyways to try to get across these ideas. But even then, I don't think a lot of free marketers had the right ideas. So from my perspective, I interpreted the 2008 crisis from the lens of von Mises' business cycle theory, which is not even well accepted among conservatives and free marketers in general. So for example, Milton Friedman did not accept von Mises' business cycle theory.
Why?
Well, Friedman very much bought into the mainstream framework. So he buys into the equilibrium framework, the mathematical analysis framework. You know, he did introduce some, or I should say reintroduced important ideas like monetarism. So the idea that money supply causes inflation had kind of been lost through the Keynesian revolution. So he did bring those back into economics, which is valuable. But it was still all at the aggregate level. So he was basically taking the Keynesian framework and just putting a monetarist spin on it, which added some value, but he's still looking at aggregates. So from his point of view, if there's no inflation, then there's no problem. So all through the 2000s, there was no inflation. Inflation was low, even though we were having this massive bubble in real estate and in house prices. So mainstream people, even the free market mainstream people like the monetarists would look and say, hey, everything's fine. Where it's only with von Mises' theory that you can penetrate deeper and say, well, no, whenever you manipulate interest rates too low, that causes distortions. That causes an overinvestment in long-term projects, long-term businesses, you know, long-term assets, and so on. And eventually, that's going to have to reverse. So at some point, you know, interest rates were lowered to 1% in 2003 by Greenspan, which was an absurd level back then. I mean, now it's not so absurd. Things are even more absurd today than they were back then. People started borrowing like crazy to buy houses. House prices started rising 10, 15% a year. And then eventually, interest rates went back up to 4 or 5%. So all these people, they wanted to get adjustable rate mortgages at 1%, 2%, 3%, because you know the interest rates are so low. But then interest rates go back up. Now all of a sudden they can't afford their mortgages. So house prices go down. Banks had overlevered and overlent and so on. And so it just kind of fed on itself. That the distortions that were caused by the low interest rates, you know, came to be seen. So initially they're invisible, but then eventually it all crashes, and that fits perfectly with von Mises' business cycle theory. But unfortunately, it's not well accepted. So.
What about college and universities in the United States? Because one of the reasons why millennials and centennials reject so much capitalism is because they relate it to huge debt in the universities, and universities costing $100,000, $200,000, and then they get in debt, and they blame capitalism for that. Could you explain what's going on with university education in the United States in that sense?
Sure. From my point of view, it is absurd. The cost of universities have grown enormously over the last 15, 20 years. I think probably twice the rate of inflation, if not more. And students are accumulating more debt to go to college. But I would blame the lion's share of that on the fact that government provides student loans. So basically, anybody who wants to go to college can apply and get student loans. That means they have more money available to pay to colleges. Colleges can raise their prices, knowing that students, however much colleges raise their prices, they know students will be able to borrow as much as they need from the government to pay for that. So it just becomes a spiral upwards. Now, if that weren't the case, so if you couldn't just easily borrow as much money as you needed for college, people would start to think more carefully, like, well, is it really worth it to pay $50,000 for this degree? Do I have any hope of actually making enough money in my lifetime to pay back the debt from doing this degree versus, going to some other college where it's less? Or, part of the problem is that we don't even have alternatives anymore because all the colleges have participated in this of raising their prices because they know they can.
Which is what happens when the government gives you privileges. Everyone wants to loot in from that privilege and get their share.
Yeah.
And it has happened with airlines in the United States, with banks, with universities, with the agricultural sector. And then you have the lobbies. In a true free market, I don't see the need for lobbies, because lobbies only act as pushers into bringing more privileges or more subsidies or protectionisms or regulations for their sector.
Right.
But all of this, airlines, universities, banks, the financial crisis of 2008, lobbies, most people relate this to free market and capitalism failing.
Right.
They don't relate it to, wait a minute, it was the government in the first place that got us into this mess.
Right.
So how come more government is going to be the solution?
Right.
But then you see people like, Bernie Sanders or Ocasio-Cortez, with this Green New Deal, or like making socialism a trending topic. But at the same time, on the other hand, you have Trump also using lobbies and protectionism and closing the economy. And people think, no, Trump is free market capitalism. These guys are proposing socialism. I don't know where in a country like the US, where there's freedom of press or freedom of expression, where to start on breaking this.
Right, that's a good question. In terms of strategy for spreading the ideas, that's something I've thought a lot about over the years, and I'm not really sure myself what the answer is. How do we break through? Who do we try to reach? What do we try to reach them with? In terms of blaming capitalism and then arguing for more government controls, I think part of it is people tend to focus on what's in front of them.
Yeah.
So Henry Hazlitt had his book, Economics in One Lesson, and the main lesson is don't just focus on the short term, focus on, and what's in front of you, focus on the long-term results and the distant results. And so then he goes through all these economic issues showing, if you just focus on the short-term results, you're going to think, oh, it's capitalism's fault and government can fix it. But if you trace the causality through the long term, then you see, oh, no, actually, it's these economic forces working out. That's what causes the problems, and it's because the government intervened in the first place. So that's one thing that people need to learn, is that don't just look at these issues on a very short-term, narrowed focus basis.
No, and also understanding, because even by talking with all the scholars of ARI, when I asked them, how do you arrive to objectivism? Some was because they were questioning religion, others through economic reasons like you, others because they were looking for a philosophical purpose. So there's like a specialization of interest, the subjective or objective value of why you would pursue these ideas. So maybe we need also specialized strategies, right? What will appeal to some audience won't appeal to others. But I think that one of the most important things that we can rescue for what you're saying is, let's focus on what worries people, right? If some people are worried about the environment, then okay, alternatives for that, or the economy, or paying a student loan, and trying to explain from that perspective. Rob, it has been a pleasure having this interview with you, and thank you for writing Foundations for a Free Society. Personally, it helped me a lot because I also feel like I have one foot in each movement.
Okay.
And I do believe that we have a lot of common ground that we can work on to bring more people in. So thank you very much.
Thank you.